Elliot Harris, a bright, eager young boy, sat comfortably in his first-class seat aboard Horizon Airlines Flight 303. It was his first time traveling alone, a reward from his parents for his exceptional academic achievements. The excitement in his eyes was unmistakable as he marveled at the plush surroundings, his mind racing with the thought of this grand experience. A first-class seat, something he had only dreamed of. It was a special occasion, one that represented the culmination of his hard work. His ticket clearly indicated Seat 3A, a prime location in the front of the plane. As he settled in, buckling his seatbelt and stowing his small carry-on bag in the overhead compartment, Elliot gazed out of the window, watching the airport shrink below. His heart raced in anticipation of the journey ahead. It was a small adventure, but to Elliot, it felt like an extraordinary opportunity, his first taste of something far beyond the ordinary. However, his peaceful moment of excitement was short-lived. Miss Caldwell, a flight attendant with a stern look, approached him as the flight was about to begin. Without hesitation, she informed him that there had been a mistake with his seating. The young boy was in a first-class seat, but Miss Caldwell seemed certain that he didn't belong there. "This seat is for first-class passengers only," she said sharply, motioning for him to move to the back of the plane. Elliot, stunned, quickly showed her his boarding pass, which clearly stated Seat 3A. However, Miss Caldwell, unyielding and confident in her judgment, dismissed the ticket without a second thought. She insisted he must have been upgraded by mistake and ordered him to move to economy. Watch the drama unfold, and let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more shocking stories. Elliot was confused. He had followed all the instructions, checked in correctly, and had been guided to his seat by the flight attendants during boarding. His ticket was legitimate, and there was no reason for anyone to doubt that he belonged in first class. Yet, Miss Caldwell seemed unmoved by his explanations. She stood with her arms crossed, eyes firmly fixed on him, as if to indicate that this was not up for debate. Elliot, who had never been in such a position before, tried his best to remain calm. "I have Seat 3A, he said quietly, holding his ticket out once more for her to see. "It's right here, see? I'm supposed to be here." But Miss Caldwell barely glanced at the ticket before dismissing it with a wave of her hand. "There's been a mistake," she said firmly. "You'll need to move to economy now. First class is reserved for our regular customers." Elliot's heart raced as the reality of the situation began to sink in. He had always respected authority, and here, in this moment, he wanted to respect Miss Caldwell's position, but he was sure there was some mistake. He couldn't help but feel humiliated. The luxury of first class had quickly turned into a nightmare. Looking around, he noticed the other passengers in the cabin had begun to notice the interaction. Some glanced in his direction with mild curiosity, while others continued to mind their own business. But there was no one offering to step in and back him up. No one was coming to his defense. It was as if he were invisible, and the situation was being handled with total indifference. "I'm sorry, but I really do belong here," Elliot said, his voice steady despite the growing anxiety. "Please, I can show you the ticket again. I'm not making this up." Miss Caldwell's stern expression didn't soften. She remained resolute. "I've told you already, you need to move," she repeated, her tone becoming less patient. She then gestured toward the back of the plane. "Economy, now." At this point, the young boy had no choice but to comply, his protests falling on deaf ears. The flight attendant's command was final, and without anyone intervening, Elliot slowly gathered his things, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. The once exciting trip was quickly turning into a humiliating experience. As he walked toward the economy section, he felt the eyes of the passengers on him. A few gave him sympathetic glances, while others simply looked away, as if this was an ordinary situation. It was anything but ordinary to Elliot. This wasn't just a seat being taken away, it was his dignity, his rights as a passenger, being ignored. He finally sat in the cramped seat at the back of the plane, his excitement replaced by confusion and a sense of injustice. As the plane took off, Elliot couldn't help but feel disconnected from the luxurious experience he was supposed to be enjoying. In the midst of this, Elliot took out his phone and sent a quick message to his father, explaining the situation. His fingers shook slightly as he typed, unsure of what would happen next. Would his father be able to fix this? Or would he have to endure the rest of the flight in silence? Elliot's heart pounded as he sat alone in the cramped economy seat, the feeling of injustice still fresh in his mind. The flight had settled into a rhythm, but his thoughts were anything but calm. He was still processing the moment when Miss Caldwell had insisted that he leave first class. This wasn't just about being wronged, it was about feeling invisible, dismissed without any real reason other than a flight attendant's assumption. The whole experience felt surreal, as though he were watching someone else's life unfold in front of him. As the minutes passed, Elliot grew increasingly uncomfortable in the back of the plane. He looked around at the other passengers who were settled in, some reading, others listening to music. They seemed oblivious to what was happening, too absorbed in their own worlds to notice the young boy who had just been unfairly treated. Just then, Elliot's phone buzzed, and he quickly glanced at the message from his father. "Stay where you are, son. I'll handle it." Elliot took a deep breath, trying to find some calm in his father's words. He knew his father was a man of action, always able to find a way to solve problems. If anyone could fix this, it was him. Elliot put the phone back in his pocket and gazed out the window, trying to block out the growing sense of frustration. As the minutes stretched on, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just a seating mix-up. He had been made to feel like an outsider, and it hurt. No child should ever feel so small and unimportant, especially when they had done nothing wrong. Just as he was beginning to feel completely defeated, a voice broke through the haze of his thoughts. A man a few rows ahead had stood up and turned toward Miss Caldwell. Elliot couldn't hear the exact words, but the tone was unmistakable. The man wasn't angry, but there was an undeniable authority in his voice. He was speaking directly to Miss Caldwell, and from the way she immediately stiffened, it was clear that he was someone important. As the plane soared through the skies, the hum of the engines and the soft murmur of passengers around him seemed to fade into the background. Elliot sat quietly in his cramped seat, staring out of the small porthole. His mind raced, replaying the events that had led him to this uncomfortable position at the back of the plane. The excitement of flying in first class had been swiftly replaced by a crushing sense of confusion and embarrassment. He had done everything right, he'd checked in, boarded as instructed, and presented his ticket when requested. But none of that seemed to matter when Miss Caldwell, a flight attendant with a sharp tone and an unwavering stance, had insisted that he was in the wrong seat. His ticket was correct, the seat number clearly indicated first class, yet Miss Caldwell had shown no interest in listening. She had firmly dismissed him, assuming he didn't belong there based on nothing more than appearance. And now, Elliot was stuck in economy, the back of the plane, feeling small and unimportant. As the plane continued its journey, Elliot's thoughts raced in circles. He could still hear the sharpness in Miss Caldwell's voice, her dismissive words echoing in his head. "This seat is for first-class passengers only." But wasn't he a first-class passenger? Why had she doubted him so easily? Elliot had been traveling alone for the first time. This trip had been a reward for his academic success, a rare opportunity to experience something outside the ordinary. His parents had been proud of his hard work, and he had been thrilled by the idea of flying in first class. Yet now, the experience felt tarnished, reduced to a moment of embarrassment that he hadn't asked for. He looked around the cabin, the soft murmur of the other passengers filling the air. No one had intervened when he was moved. No one had stepped in to defend him. The silence of the others made the moment feel even more isolating. He wasn't a child in a classroom, and no teacher was around to back him up. He was just one more passenger on a plane, ignored and dismissed, his words drowned out by the authority of a flight attendant who thought she knew better. His thoughts were interrupted by the gentle buzz of his phone, vibrating on the seat in front of him. Elliot's heart skipped a beat as he saw the message from his father: "Stay where you are, son. I'll handle it." A wave of relief washed over him, knowing that his father, someone who had always been there to support him, was on his side. But as comforting as his father's words were, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling of being powerless. What if his father couldn't fix it? What if this was something that couldn't be undone? He was alone now, without the comfort of his parents' presence, facing the cold reality of being judged for something beyond his control. As the plane continued its course, Elliot's mind wandered again, his focus shifting to the sound of footsteps approaching. He glanced up and saw Miss Caldwell walking down the aisle, her brisk stride unwavering. She was heading in his direction, but this time, it was different. There was no more authority in her movement, no more of the sharp confidence she had shown earlier. Her face was more rigid, her steps uncertain. It was as though the situation had changed for her too, and she no longer seemed quite as sure of herself. Miss Caldwell stopped beside Elliot's seat, her eyes briefly meeting his before she looked away. She was quiet for a moment, her expression tense, as if she were struggling to figure out what to do next. "Elliot," she said, her voice softer than it had been before, I need to apologize for earlier. I was wrong. I shouldn't have assumed that you didn't belong in first class." Elliot didn't immediately respond. The apology, while appreciated, didn't immediately resolve the feeling of humiliation that still lingered. But something about the way she spoke, the way her tone had shifted, made him realize that this wasn't just about a mistake with seating arrangements. It was about something deeper, about recognizing her own assumptions and the biases that had led her to treat him the way she had. "I showed you my ticket," Elliot said, his voice steady but carrying a trace of frustration. "I tried to explain that I belonged there, but you didn't listen." Miss Caldwell nodded, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I didn't listen. And that's something I need to own." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I was so quick to judge, and I didn't stop to think that you might be exactly where you were supposed to be." There was a long silence between them as the plane continued to hum softly. Elliot glanced at Miss Caldwell, her usually confident demeanor now replaced with something more vulnerable. In that moment, he saw her not as an authority figure, but as someone who was grappling with her own mistake. It wasn't a moment of vindication for him, but it was an acknowledgement that Miss Caldwell was, at least, beginning to see things differently. "I'm sorry," she said again, more earnestly this time, her voice almost apologetic. "I shouldn't have acted that way. I'm sorry for putting you in that position." Elliot gave a small, thoughtful nod. He didn't need her to apologize, it wasn't about that. But the sincerity in her voice was something he hadn't expected. Maybe there was more to this experience than just his own discomfort. Maybe it wasn't just about the seat, it was about how one interaction could shape someone's view of the world, how easy it was to judge others based on assumptions, and how powerful it could be to recognize and correct that behavior. As Miss Caldwell stood there, waiting for his response, Elliot realized that the moment was more than just about getting back to first class. It was about something bigger, the need to understand, the need to listen, and the need to respect others, regardless of who they were. The journey ahead would no longer be just about a plane ride. It would be about change, for both of them. As the plane continued its journey toward its final destination, the tension between Miss Caldwell and Elliot had not entirely dissolved. Despite her apology, there was still an air of discomfort in the cabin. The flight attendants were moving about, preparing for the landing, but Miss Caldwell seemed lost in her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling of having failed her duty, failed to see past her own biases. And worse, she had failed Elliot in the most basic way, by not listening. The boy had been treated unfairly, and now, she would have to live with the knowledge that she had contributed to his discomfort. The hum of the aircraft and the rustling of passengers preparing to land were the only sounds breaking the silence between Miss Caldwell and Elliot. She couldn't help but keep glancing over at him. His calmness, his ability to remain composed despite the situation, was a stark contrast to her own mounting frustration and regret. It was like looking at a mirror that reflected her own flaws back at her. For Elliot, the apology, though appreciated, hadn't entirely fixed things. The situation was far from over. Miss Caldwell had done her part in acknowledging her mistake, but Elliot still couldn't understand why it had happened in the first place. He had shown his ticket. He had followed the instructions. Yet, for some reason, she had insisted he was in the wrong. Even though she had apologized, the damage was done, and it was impossible to undo the embarrassment he had felt. As the flight attendants began to make their final rounds, Miss Caldwell approached Elliot's row once more, her eyes downcast in an attempt to avoid making eye contact. She had already apologized once, but something about the situation still weighed on her. She felt compelled to do more, to make things right in a way that went beyond words. What could she say or do to help Elliot feel as though he had been truly acknowledged, not just as a passenger but as a person? "Elliot," Miss Caldwell began, her voice softer now than before, "I've been thinking about what happened, and I realize that I made a huge mistake. I want to make it clear that what I did was wrong, not just because I was mistaken about your seat, but because I failed to see you as a person with dignity and rights. You showed me your ticket, and I should have trusted you. I should have listened." Elliot turned to her, his face expressionless, but his eyes held something Miss Caldwell hadn't expected: understanding. He didn't seem angry or resentful, but rather, he seemed unaffected by her apology. For a moment, Miss Caldwell wondered if he was simply being polite, but then she realized, it was more than that. Elliot had already moved past the need for validation. He had endured the moment, and now he was ready to move on, too. "It's all right," Elliot said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "I know you didn't mean to treat me like that. But it was still hard. You were sure about something that wasn't true. I just wanted to be treated fairly, to not be assumed to be in the wrong when I wasn't." Miss Caldwell nodded, feeling a lump rise in her throat. She had wanted to make this right, but the simple truth was, she couldn't erase what had happened. What she could do, however, was listen, and she had failed to do that in the first place. "I understand now," she said quietly, "and I'll make sure this doesn't happen again, not to you or anyone else. I'll do better." Elliot offered her a small nod, acknowledging her words. It wasn't an acceptance of her apology, but rather a silent acknowledgement that sometimes, words were just the beginning. What mattered more was the change that came after. The plane began its descent, and the cabin lights flickered on, signaling that they were approaching the airport. As the plane banked gently to the side, Miss Caldwell glanced at Elliot once more. He had returned to his seat by the window, his eyes focused on the view outside. He seemed unbothered by the turbulent journey they had just endured together, and for a moment, Miss Caldwell marveled at his resilience. She had assumed that because she was in control, her word was final, and that was where she had gone wrong. The power dynamics that existed between flight attendants and passengers had created an environment where she thought her authority was absolute. But Elliot's ability to remain calm in the face of mistreatment had reminded her that authority wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about mutual respect. She couldn't expect respect from others if she wasn't willing to extend it in the first place. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, Miss Caldwell felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had learned a valuable lesson about herself, about the way she treated others, and about the assumptions she made based on surface-level judgments. She had been wrong, but this experience would not only make her a better flight attendant, it would make her a more empathetic person. She couldn't change the past, but she could change how she approached situations in the future. As passengers began to gather their belongings, preparing to disembark, Miss Caldwell glanced toward Elliot's seat once more. He had already started gathering his things, preparing to leave the plane. Despite everything, there was no bitterness in his demeanor. Just a quiet determination, as though he had already moved on from the ordeal. And in that moment, Miss Caldwell realized something crucial: sometimes, the best way to move forward was not to focus on fixing what had gone wrong, but to learn from it and grow stronger as a result. As the airplane cruised smoothly through the sky, Miss Caldwell could feel the weight of her actions bearing down on her. Every passing minute seemed to stretch longer, the discomfort of her mistake growing ever more pronounced. She had made a decision that she wasn't proud of, and now she was left to live with it. She thought of Elliot, how calm and composed he had remained throughout the ordeal, how he hadn't raised his voice or escalated the situation, but simply accepted her poor judgment. It was a level of maturity that had surprised her, and yet, it had also left her feeling foolish. She watched Elliot, who now sat in his original first-class seat, and couldn't help but reflect on the entire exchange. He had clearly shown her his first-class ticket, but she had dismissed it with a wave of her hand, assuming, based solely on his appearance, that he didn't belong. The moment he had been forced to leave the first-class cabin and sit in economy was humiliating, and Miss Caldwell knew she had made a mistake that would follow her throughout the flight. What bothered her most was that she hadn't questioned her actions earlier. She hadn't asked herself whether she was making the right decision. She had acted on assumption, on bias, nothing more. And she realized that the consequences of such unchecked behavior went beyond one boy's discomfort. It was a symptom of a much larger issue, one that ran deep within the airline industry, and perhaps even society as a whole. The assumption that people like Elliot, young and with no outward markers of privilege, didn't belong in certain spaces, spaces like first class, was an example of the biases that needed to be addressed, not just by the airline but by every person who worked within it. The flight attendants were busy preparing for the plane's descent, but Miss Caldwell felt a sudden sense of urgency. She needed to confront the reality of what had just occurred. There was no going back. She had made a mistake, but there was still time to try and correct it, to make it right, not only with Elliot, but with herself. If she truly wanted to improve, to be better at her job and as a person, she would have to face the consequences of her actions and learn from them. She couldn't pretend that this was just a small incident that would be forgotten once they landed. This moment would shape her moving forward, whether she liked it or not. As the captain's voice came over the intercom to announce their final descent, Miss Caldwell walked to the galley at the back of the plane, trying to clear her mind. She hadn't spoken to anyone yet about what had happened, she hadn't even fully processed it herself. But she knew she needed to take the next step, to admit that she had been wrong and confront the weight of her own assumptions. Her actions had affected someone else, and she couldn't brush that aside. She needed to speak to Elliot, to apologize sincerely, and to ensure that he knew it was not about him. It was about her failing to see him as an individual deserving of the respect that any first-class passenger should receive. As the plane began to level out, Miss Caldwell noticed the younger flight attendant, Nicole, walking toward her. Nicole had been the one who had seemed uneasy during the entire exchange, offering glances of uncertainty as Miss Caldwell insisted that Elliot vacate the seat. The young flight attendant, who had only recently started with the airline, hadn't said much during the encounter, but Miss Caldwell could tell that she had been uncomfortable with how things had unfolded. "Miss Caldwell, can we talk for a moment?" Nicole's voice was tentative, and Miss Caldwell could see the concern in her eyes. Miss Caldwell nodded, stepping aside to let Nicole join her in the galley. "I know what you're thinking," Miss Caldwell began, her voice quiet. "And you're right. I shouldn't have acted the way I did." Nicole hesitated before speaking. I just didn't know what to say. It felt off, but I didn't want to make things worse by questioning you in front of the passengers. But that boy, he seemed really calm. I don't know, I just got a bad feeling about it." Miss Caldwell sighed, her head bowed slightly in shame. "It wasn't just about that boy, Nicole. It was about everything. I let my assumptions get in the way of doing what's right. And I was wrong. I treated him like he didn't belong there, simply because of the way he looked. I didn't even think to check his ticket properly before I made him move. I made a mistake." Nicole nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I understand. It's just, he seemed so polite, so patient. It was like he didn't even want to cause trouble, even though you were asking him to move. I could tell he was upset, but he never raised his voice. I know, Miss Caldwell replied, her voice thick with regret. And that's what bothers me. He was the one who should have been upset, but he wasn't. He handled it with more maturity than I did. I shouldn't have let my assumptions cloud my judgment like that. Nicole looked at her sympathetically. I think we all make mistakes, Miss Caldwell. But it's how we handle them that counts, right? Miss Caldwell met Nicole's eyes, feeling a sense of gratitude for the younger attendant's understanding. I'll do better. I promise. I need to be more aware of how I treat people. It's not just about following protocol. It's about seeing people for who they are, not judging them based on anything other than what's right in front of us. The two flight attendants stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the plane filling the space between them. Miss Caldwell felt the weight of the conversation settle within her, but there was also something lighter, something that allowed her to breathe more easily. She knew that taking responsibility for her actions was the first step, but it wouldn't be the last. Just then, the captain's voice came over the intercom again, announcing that they would be landing shortly. Miss Caldwell nodded and turned to head back to the front of the plane. But before she could walk away, Nicole spoke up one last time. Do you think you'll apologize to him? To Elliot? Miss Caldwell paused, her hand resting on the galley doorframe. She looked back at Nicole, her eyes filled with resolve. Yes. I will. It's the least I can do. As the plane prepared to land, Miss Caldwell knew that her actions would have consequences she couldn't undo. But she also knew that she had the opportunity to change. The encounter with Elliot had shaken her, but it had also opened her eyes to a greater responsibility, one that went beyond simply following rules. It was about treating people with dignity, regardless of their background or appearance. And as the flight began its descent, Miss Caldwell found herself ready to face the next step in her journey. To make things right with Elliot and to learn from the mistake that had, in many ways, changed her perspective forever. The flight had landed, and as the passengers disembarked, the tension still lingered in the air. Miss Caldwell had already apologized to Elliot, but there was no quick fix for what had happened. It was more than just a seating error, it was a moment that exposed her biases, something she would have to confront not just with him but also with herself. She could feel the eyes of other crew members on her, some of them offering sympathetic glances, while others avoided looking her way altogether. As Elliot walked down the jetway, still composed despite everything, Miss Caldwell couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration. He had been treated unfairly, yet he had never once shown anger, never raised his voice or caused a scene. The way he carried himself made her realize how much she had to learn, not just about being a flight attendant but about being a better person. She had failed him that day, and there was no way to escape the consequences of that mistake. Her judgment had been clouded by assumptions, and she knew that if she was to continue in her role, she would have to do more than just apologize. She would have to prove that she could grow from this experience. As she stood by the aircraft door, her phone buzzed. It was a message from the airline's senior management. Her heart sank, and she read the message with a sense of dread. It was short and to the point. Please meet with Captain Reynolds and HR upon arrival for a debrief. We'll discuss your next steps then. Miss Caldwell felt her stomach tighten. She had known that this moment would come, that the consequences of her actions wouldn't end with an apology. She was being called in for a debrief, and she had no illusions about what that meant. There was a chance her actions would result in disciplinary measures. And while she had made peace with the fact that she needed to be held accountable, the uncertainty of what lay ahead made her uneasy. She walked to the crew lounge, where Captain Reynolds and a few members of the HR team were already waiting. Their expressions were unreadable, but Miss Caldwell could sense the seriousness of the situation. She took a deep breath before stepping into the room, steeling herself for whatever would come next. Miss Caldwell, Captain Reynolds said, his tone neutral but firm. "We've been briefed on what happened during the flight. I understand there was an issue with a first-class passenger, and we need to address it." Miss Caldwell nodded, doing her best to maintain composure. "Yes, Captain. I made a mistake. I didn't listen to the passenger's ticket and assumed he didn't belong in first class. I forced him to move, and it was wrong." The HR representative, a woman named Claire, glanced at her notes before looking up at Miss Caldwell. "We've reviewed the situation from both the flight's perspective and the feedback from the crew. It's clear that your actions were based on an assumption, and that assumption caused unnecessary distress for the passenger. We take these matters seriously, especially when it comes to treating every passenger with respect and dignity." Miss Caldwell could feel her face flush with embarrassment. The words were difficult to hear, but she knew they were true. She had failed Elliot, and now she had to face the consequences. She couldn't hide from her mistake, no matter how hard it was. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the growing anxiety in her chest. "I acted out of judgment, and I can see now that I've made a poor decision. I was wrong to treat him that way. I should have listened to him, and I should have respected his position as a first-class passenger." Captain Reynolds leaned forward slightly, his expression softening. "I appreciate that you're taking responsibility. However, we also need to consider the broader implications of what happened. This isn't just about a seating issue, it's about ensuring that all passengers feel safe and respected, no matter who they are. The assumption you made, based on the boy's appearance, can't happen again. We need to ensure that you, and the rest of the crew, are trained to recognize and challenge those assumptions." Claire nodded, adding, "We'll be implementing additional training for all crew members to address unconscious bias and ensure that every passenger is treated fairly. This will be a priority moving forward. However, we also want to make sure that you, Miss Caldwell, have the support you need to move forward from this." Miss Caldwell swallowed hard. She had no excuse for what had happened, but she appreciated that the airline was taking steps to address the systemic issues that had led to her behavior. She wasn't the only one who needed to change. Everyone needed to do their part to create an environment where biases were challenged, not perpetuated. "I'm committed to doing better," she said firmly. "I've learned a hard lesson, and I'll work as hard as I can to make sure something like this never happens again." Captain Reynolds looked at her for a moment, his expression softening. "We'll give you the opportunity to improve, but this will require your full commitment. You'll be reassigned to other duties for the next few weeks while we assess the situation and provide additional training. We're going to need your full cooperation." Miss Caldwell nodded again, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. She knew this would be a turning point in her career. She was being given a chance to redeem herself, but she also understood that she would have to prove herself in a way she never had before. As the meeting concluded, Miss Caldwell stood up to leave, her mind swirling with the weight of the conversation. She knew that she couldn't undo what had happened, but she was determined to make things right. She had to learn, and she had to grow. She walked out of the room, her steps slow but purposeful. As she made her way down the hallway, she saw the crew members going about their tasks, preparing for the next flight. They didn't look at her the same way anymore, not with respect, but with curiosity. She had failed them, too, in a way, by not setting the right example. They had witnessed her mistake, and now it was up to her to show them that she was capable of doing better. Outside, the air was crisp, and as Miss Caldwell took a deep breath, she realized that this wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. The lesson she had learned, however painful, was one that would stay with her for the rest of her career, and the rest of her life. As she looked out across the tarmac, she couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. She would rebuild her reputation, not just for the sake of her job, but for her own growth as a person. The journey ahead would be challenging, but it would be worth it. The hours after the meeting with Captain Reynolds and Claire, the HR representative, were some of the most difficult Miss Caldwell had faced in her career. The plane had landed, and she was now in the terminal, preparing for her next steps. Her mind kept returning to the events of the flight, how quickly things had escalated, how easily she had dismissed a passenger, Lucas, the young boy who had been traveling alone to celebrate his academic excellence. It had been a simple mistake at first, a seating mix-up that should have been addressed without conflict. But instead, it had spiraled into something far bigger. Something much more personal. As she stood in the terminal, Miss Caldwell couldn't help but replay the way she had treated Lucas. The brief moments of exchange, the tension in the air, the way she had been so certain that he didn't belong in first class. How could she have missed the clear signs that something was wrong? She had made assumptions based on appearance, something she had been taught from the very beginning not to do. The ticket was there, right in front of her, but she had chosen not to believe it. In doing so, she had undermined the very principles that the airline was built upon: fairness, respect, and customer service. She had failed, and now she had to confront it. Her phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from Lucas's father, Mr. Morgan, the airline's owner. The message was simple and direct: meet me in the lounge. We need to discuss what happened. Her heart sank as she read the message. She knew this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. She had already faced consequences from the HR team, who had informed her that she would be reassigned to desk duties while they reviewed her actions. They had also scheduled mandatory bias training for her, something that Miss Caldwell knew she needed, but it didn't stop the weight of shame she carried. She took a deep breath and made her way to the lounge. When she arrived, she found Mr. Morgan sitting alone, a cup of coffee in front of him. He didn't look angry, but there was a certain weight to his gaze that made Miss Caldwell uneasy. She had never spoken to him directly before, and now, under these circumstances, the situation felt even more intimidating. Miss Caldwell, Mr. Morgan said, nodding to the seat across from him. Please, have a seat. She did as instructed, feeling her palms begin to sweat as she sat down. Mr. Morgan, I'm truly sorry for what happened. I understand how serious it is. I've already spoken with Captain Reynolds and HR, and I accept whatever consequences come my way. Mr. Morgan took a slow sip of his coffee, his expression thoughtful. What you did goes beyond just the incident with Lucas. It's not just about asking him to move from first class. It's about how you saw him. How you made assumptions based on who you thought he was. That's the issue here, Miss Caldwell. It's not about whether or not you did your job properly. It's about how you treated a person. Her face flushed as she listened to his words. He was right. She had assumed that Lucas didn't belong there, based on nothing more than how he appeared. She had treated him like an outsider, someone who wasn't worthy of the luxury that came with being a first-class passenger. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a reflection of her own biases, ones she hadn't realized were there until now. I understand, Miss Caldwell said, her voice barely above a whisper. And I regret it. I regret not giving him the benefit of the doubt, not listening to him, not even thinking to check the ticket properly before making a decision. Mr. Morgan nodded, but there was no anger in his expression, just a quiet disappointment. I know you don't see yourself as someone who would discriminate. But this is what we're dealing with in society, unconscious bias that manifests in ways we don't even realize. And it's something that's going to take time to undo, both in the industry and in ourselves. But here's the thing, Miss Caldwell, you can't fix it unless you first acknowledge it. I'm trying to do that, Miss Caldwell replied, her voice growing firmer. I'm committed to learning from this. I've already asked to be put into additional training, and I want to make sure I'm better at recognizing these biases going forward. Mr. Morgan studied her for a moment before leaning back in his chair. I believe you. But the change has to come from more than just you. It has to come from the company as a whole. If we are going to truly create an environment where everyone is treated equally, then it has to start with the way we train our employees, how we enforce those standards, and how we hold people accountable. Miss Caldwell nodded again. She had been caught in a moment of her own weakness, but now she was seeing the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one mistake on one flight. This was about systemic change, a shift that needed to happen on a larger scale. "I want to help," Miss Caldwell said, her resolve strengthening. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't happen again. Not just with me, but with everyone who works here. We need to make sure this doesn't become a pattern." Mr. Morgan looked at her, his gaze still steady. "I'm glad to hear that, Miss Caldwell. We'll begin by having a thorough review of all our training programs, starting with bias and diversity training. It will be mandatory for all crew members, not just flight attendants, but also pilots and other staff. If we're going to change the culture, it starts from the top down. And we'll be looking to you to help make that shift. It won't be easy, but it's necessary." As he spoke, Miss Caldwell realized that the road ahead was going to be long. It wouldn't be enough to simply apologize and move on. This was going to require a deeper, more lasting commitment, not just from her, but from everyone involved. She was part of a much larger system, and if she was going to fix her mistake, she had to be willing to take responsibility for it, and to help shape the system that had led to it. "I'm ready to do the work," she said quietly, meeting Mr. Morgan's gaze. "I'll be part of the solution, not just the problem." Mr. Morgan gave a small, approving nod. "I believe you. Just remember, this is a learning process for all of us. And we're in this together. We'll get there, one step at a time." With that, Miss Caldwell stood, her mind already racing with the changes she needed to implement, the conversations she needed to have, and the work she needed to do. It wasn't just about apologizing anymore. It was about transformation, both in herself and in the airline industry. This was her opportunity to make a lasting difference. As she left the lounge, Miss Caldwell felt a renewed sense of purpose. The challenge ahead was daunting, but it was one she was ready to face head-on. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be many obstacles along the way. But if she was going to make it right, she would give everything she had to make sure it happened. As Miss Caldwell watched the final passengers disembark, the weight of the situation lingered. She had gone through the motions of offering an apology, but the true sense of accountability had yet to fully settle in. There was a deep, lingering unease that would not dissipate until the full scope of her actions had been acknowledged and addressed, not just with Lucas, but with herself. The mistake she had made had been a personal one, and it was about more than just a seating issue. It was about how easily people could be overlooked and dismissed when assumptions were made based on appearance. And now, as the last few passengers made their way off the plane, Miss Caldwell realized that her journey of reflection had only just begun. She had made a significant error in judgment. The way she had treated Lucas, the young boy who had simply shown his first-class ticket and expected to be treated as any passenger should, had been driven by an unconscious bias she hadn't realized was there. It was easy for her to see herself as someone who was beyond such biases, someone who followed protocol and made decisions quickly and decisively. But what she had failed to see was that in her certainty, she had overlooked the very essence of respect and fairness that should have guided her actions. Her attention shifted back to Lucas. Despite everything that had happened, the young boy had handled the situation with remarkable composure. He hadn't raised his voice in anger, he hadn't caused a scene, he hadn't demanded retribution. Instead, he had simply gone along with the uncomfortable turn of events, accepting the mistreatment with a quiet dignity. It was almost as if he were saying, "I know who I am, and I don't need to prove it to you." That single moment, when he had sat back in economy class, staring out of the window without showing signs of distress, was a lesson Miss Caldwell would not forget. As Miss Caldwell gathered her belongings, preparing to exit the plane and head to the terminal, her mind wandered to the larger implications of what had transpired. This wasn't just about her failure to properly manage a seating mix-up, it was about the subtle, pervasive biases that had played a role in her decision-making process. It was about the assumption that Lucas, based solely on his appearance, didn't belong in first class, a place usually reserved for adults, for businesspeople, for those who could afford the luxury. But Lucas didn't need to prove his worth, his ticket already did that. Her phone buzzed again, breaking her thoughts. It was a message from Captain Reynolds, reminder to meet with him and the HR team for a debriefing session when they returned to the terminal. She knew that the consequences of her actions would continue to unfold, and the conversation would be uncomfortable. But it was necessary. She had to face it head-on. It was the only way to truly begin the process of growth and improvement. As Miss Caldwell walked down the jet bridge, she took in the hum of the airport around her. The bustle of people, the clatter of luggage being loaded, the low murmur of voices, it all felt distant, like the world was carrying on without her. She was left to grapple with the aftermath of her actions, and though the experience had shaken her, it had also sparked something new within her, a commitment to change. When she entered the crew lounge, Captain Reynolds and the HR team were already waiting for her. They looked up as she entered, their expressions neutral but professional. It was clear from the way the room had been set up that this conversation was going to be more formal than she had anticipated. Captain Reynolds gave her a slight nod as she sat down, but there was no small talk, only a palpable sense of seriousness. "Miss Caldwell," Captain Reynolds began, "we've reviewed what happened during the flight. HR has already gone over the necessary steps for you, but we want to address the broader picture here, the issues that go beyond the individual incident." Miss Caldwell nodded, her throat tight as she prepared to listen. "I understand, Captain. I know I made a mistake, and I'm here to take full responsibility for it." "We appreciate that," said Claire, the HR representative, who had been taking notes during the meeting. "But what's important here is not just acknowledging your mistake, it's about addressing how we, as a company, handle situations like this moving forward. There's an underlying issue of bias here, Miss Caldwell. We can't afford to ignore it." "I agree," Miss Caldwell said, her voice firming as she spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. I let my assumptions dictate my actions, and I failed to see Lucas as a person deserving of respect and the benefit of the doubt. I've realized that I have a responsibility not just to follow protocol, but to treat every passenger with dignity, no matter their appearance, no matter their background." Captain Reynolds leaned forward, his expression softening. "And that's the key point, Miss Caldwell. This isn't about one isolated incident. It's about ensuring that this kind of mistake doesn't happen again, not just from you, but from anyone on the team. This situation highlighted an issue that goes beyond individual conduct, it's about changing the way we approach customer service across the board. We need a culture shift, one where bias isn't just recognized but actively addressed." Claire nodded in agreement. "We've already begun drafting a new training initiative focused on unconscious bias and diversity training. It's not enough to just teach our crew the rules, we need to challenge our own internal assumptions and confront the biases that affect how we interact with passengers." Miss Caldwell felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she listened. This wasn't just about punitive measures or reprimanding her, it was about addressing a much bigger issue. She wasn't alone in this, and the company was taking meaningful steps to change the culture. "We're also going to require all flight attendants, pilots, and ground staff to undergo the new training program," Captain Reynolds continued. "And moving forward, we'll be emphasizing the importance of communication between crew members when there's an issue. We need to support each other in these situations, not just react based on assumptions." Miss Caldwell's heart lightened at hearing this. It was clear that the airline was taking this matter seriously, but more importantly, they were committed to making long-term changes that would ensure fairness and respect for all passengers. This was the kind of change she had hoped for. Claire looked at Miss Caldwell and spoke again. "We'll also be reviewing all complaint procedures and how incidents like this are handled. We need to make sure that any passenger who feels mistreated has a safe and clear path to report their concerns. That kind of transparency is crucial to creating an environment of trust." Captain Reynolds smiled slightly, his tone softening. "Miss Caldwell, you've been a part of this company for a long time. We believe in your ability to grow from this and to help lead the way in creating a better experience for everyone. Miss Caldwell smiled, feeling a sense of gratitude for the opportunity to make things right. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but she was ready to take on that responsibility. She had learned something invaluable from this experience, not just about her actions, but about the way society's biases could so easily influence decisions. She stood up, ready to leave the room, when Captain Reynolds called after her. "One more thing, Miss Caldwell. You'll be taking a few weeks off to complete the new training, but I'll be assigning you to a mentor during this period to guide you through this process. This is a chance for you to reflect, learn, and come back stronger." Miss Caldwell nodded, feeling a mix of relief and determination. She had a lot of work ahead of her, but for the first time in a long while, she felt confident that she was on the right path. The changes she would undergo would not only make her a better flight attendant, they would make her a better person. As she exited the room and walked toward the gate, her thoughts turned to Lucas. He had been a catalyst for change, not just in her own career, but within the airline itself. She would never forget his quiet dignity, the way he had handled the situation without bitterness or anger. He had taught her more than she could have learned in any training session. And with that, Miss Caldwell knew that her journey was far from over. It was only just beginning. Miss Caldwell stood at the gate, her thoughts swirling as she prepared to board the next flight. The events of the previous days had left an indelible mark on her, one that would shape how she approached her work moving forward. She had learned many things from the situation with Lucas, about bias, assumptions, and the importance of treating every passenger with the respect they deserved. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned about herself. She had made a mistake, but it was a mistake that had led to growth, both personally and professionally. Lucas's quiet dignity throughout the ordeal had been a lesson in itself. Despite the humiliation he had faced, he had shown nothing but grace. His ability to remain composed had shaken Miss Caldwell to her core, forcing her to confront the prejudices she didn't even realize she held. But that moment of discomfort had pushed her toward change. It had made her reflect on her own actions and what kind of flight attendant, and person, she wanted to be. As she walked toward the plane, Miss Caldwell couldn't help but think about the training that lay ahead, the unconscious bias and diversity training that the airline had already begun rolling out. It was a critical step, not just for her, but for every member of the crew. She understood now that the issue wasn't just about one mistake, it was about creating a culture where assumptions were actively challenged, and every passenger was treated with respect, regardless of their background or appearance. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear, she was ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. She had a responsibility to be better, not just for herself, but for the passengers she served. The road to change would be long, but Miss Caldwell was determined to walk it, one step at a time. As she boarded the plane, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. There was much work to be done, and she was ready to do her part. And as for Lucas? His quiet strength had left a lasting impression. It had been a turning point for her, a reminder that change often begins with a single moment of clarity.